Okay, Parshas Shemos, beginning of Chumash Shemos also. The Torah here discusses the enslavement of the Jewish people and the initiation of Moshe Rabbeinu's attempts and ultimately successful attempts to free the Jewish people, acting as the shliach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, acting as the messenger of God. And initially, when Moshe Rabbeinu comes to talk to Paro, and Paro reacts in a very with a negation of any form of humanity. And not only does he not lighten the load of the Jewish people, but on the contrary, he increases their burden. And they have to collect the straw that is necessary for the bricks that they were forced to use in building all kinds of edifices for Paro and for Egypt. And the pasuk has the expression that Paro used is Tichbar havoda l'anashim. Let the work be heavier upon the men, the Yasuva, and let them do it, Ba'al Yishu b'divrei shaker, and let them not cry out with false words. Now, the Baal Haturim there is somewhat very strange, and the Baal Haturim points out that the word Yishu in 3 or 4 different places in Tanakh are interrelated one with the other. And the first place is here. Val Yishu b'divrei shaker, let them not cry out with false words. And the Baal Haturim interprets it, it's a little strange, but the Baal Haturim interprets it as talking of davening, Yishu in the sense of crying out in a false manner. And crying out in a false manner, the Baal Haturim says, what makes it a false manner? What makes it a false manner is the fact that one cries or davens or approaches God without kavanah. What is kavanah? Kavanah means with the concentration of the heart. A person just says the words. He doesn't mean what he says. So even though Paro certainly was not concerned about whether the Jewish people were davening, were praying in a proper manner, but he used an expression that would indicate that he felt that even when they were crying out, and even when they were crying out to God, it was in a false manner. But he was intimidated by the very fact that they were crying out, because the crying out itself represented to him the seeds of rebellion. So he says the Baal Haturim says that here Yishu v'ein Moshiach, it has reference to those who osam she'ein mechavnem b'tfilasam, those who do not have proper intention when they're davening. It could be that even though Paro himself might not have had, according to Baal Haturim, had reference to the davening itself, but perhaps a person could suggest that the words out of Paro's mouth was not only expressive about what the word, about his concern about words of rebellion, but perhaps heaven forced Paro to say the words in order that we should know that tefillah, that crying out in time of trouble, one has to be careful not only about saying the words of crying out to God, but has to have the proper intention when he cries out to God as well. Okay, that's one word. That's one case where it's mentioned. And then there is another case in Shmuel. So it says there in Shmuel Perik Beis, Pasuk Mem Beis, in Shir David, Yishuv Ein Moshiach. They will cry out and there will be no salvation. So the Baal Haturim says, why? David there is talking about some of his enemies. And even it's pointed out, not just his enemies on the borders or from outside the borders of Israel, but the enemies from within Israel as well. And sometimes these enemies also speak in the name of Torah, speak in the name of Tefila, also identify officially with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he said, the Baal Haturim says that David was making reference to the fact that these people who daven to God, who are his enemies, they do not have the proper attitudes, the proper kavanah. And then in Yeshaya, it says, Us tikra, Yeshaya Parak Nudches, Pasuk Tes, Us tikra of Hashem Yana, Teshava, the Yomar Hineni. Then you'll call out to God, and God will answer. Teshava, when you'll cry out, God will say, Hineni, here I am. Now, it's, in other words, when is our tefillas answered? According to the Baal Haturim, the tefillos are answered when we have the proper intention, the proper kavanah. But if we just cry out, or we just read, we just say our tefillos without the heart, and the tefillah davening is called avoda b'leiv, service of the heart. So then it's nothing. So, and then David HaMelech said in Tehillim, Hazina tefilasi below sipsei mirma. Listen to my tefillas that are without deceit. And Targum the Baal Haturim says, what does it mean, tefillos, my prayers that are without deceit? Means tefillos that have tefillos that I have kavanah, that I have the proper intention. But if I do not have the proper intention, if I do not have the proper kavanah, then the tefillah, the words uttered in the davening, are considered deceitful. We have to understand why it's considered deceitful, and also we should understand why if a person is mispalel davens in the proper manner, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will say, Hineni, here I am. What's the idea behind these words? Now, it's interesting when we take a look at the Parshas Bikurim. The Parshas Bikurim, when the Jew brought his first fruit to Yerushalayim, so he would recite a parsha of the Torah in which he talked about how Kadosh Baruch Hu chose Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and ultimately, and he promised to give them the land of Eretz Yisrael to their descendants, and how Yaakov ultimately has to go down to Egypt, and how the Jewish people are enslaved in Egypt, and the trouble that they encounter in Egypt. And then all of a sudden, a turn takes place. And then it talks about how the Jewish people were redeemed in Egypt, how God saved the Jews, about how God dealt with their slave masters, how they were punished for the way the Jewish people were treated, and how the Jewish people were ultimately redeemed. And it continues how the Jewish people went to Eretz Yisrael, and recognition of the fact that Eretz Yisrael, that we have in Eretz Yisrael, and even the fruit that are now being produced in Eretz Yisrael, it was ultimately given to him by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, given to him by God. And the pasuk says there, when it talks about the turn of events, what caused the change? At what point do we see the change beginning? Not that there weren't situations that somehow would indicate that for temporarily things got worse also. But where does the change take place? When we look back, and that is the Parsha Bikurim. When we read it in the Shemos, it talks about the events as the events are occurring, are taking place. But Parshas Bikurim is looking back at the events. And sometimes, as the events are unfolding, something that actually is part of our process of redemption could be perceived as part of the enslavement. But when we look back, we have a clearer picture of what's taking place. And we say, by Nitzak El Hashem, this is where the turn takes place. We cried out to God, Elokei Avoseinu. And then, as we say in the Haggadah, Kamo Shenemar, as it says. And then they mention a pasuk in this week's Sedra. Vayihi bayomim harabim ahaim, and it was in those many days. Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, died. And the children of Israel groaned because of the work, and they cried out. Vayizoku, they cried out. Val Tal Shavasam Elokim. Their outcry because of the work went up to God. And God heard, Vayishmal Kim Es Nakasam, God heard their cries, their moaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. Now, there's a famous question, Rashi mentions it. And the question is, the king of Egypt dies, and the Jewish people groaned. Okay, perhaps their situation did not become better. But why should it become worse? Because the Pharaoh died. It's very strange to understand. Why should it become worse? And the Rashi says that the Rashi cites a medrash that the king of Egypt didn't die, but he became very sick. And it was a sickness that was identified almost with death. Sometimes people, when somebody is very sick, people use the expression, he's dead already. Unfortunately, sometimes we hear these type of comments almost from doctors as well. And their practice of medicine sometimes is based on this attitude. And so the king of Egypt died, and he was told by some of his advisors, I guess, who were based on the science or the lack of science of their day, that in order to cure himself, he has to bathe himself in blood. And he took the blood of young Jewish children and he used their blood to bathe himself. So that's why it says, Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt died, Vayayonchu. And as a result of that, the Jewish people groaned. Okay, that's clearly is not the simple pshat. And it could be, and you see from many of the Mefarshim, that they explain the Torah literally here, not in accordance with the drasha that is cited by Rashi. It's possible during the duration of the Jewish people's stay in Egypt, of their enslavement in Egypt, it's very likely there was more than one or two kings. And it's possible that both are true. And the Pasuk writes it as it was one event. It could be there was a time when one of the Paros became very sick. And for his cure, or what he thought was a cure, he slaughtered Jewish children. But that doesn't take the pasuk out from the simple explanation, because apparently there was a time when the king of Egypt died. And even though the king of Egypt, the oppressor of the Jew, died, the Jewish people groaned. And why did they groan? And I think if we take a look at last week's Sedra, the first Rashi in last week's Sedra, Yaakov Eretz Mitzrayim Shvas Reishana. Yaakov lived in Egypt 17 years. And Rashi says, Parshas Ustuma. This Parsha is a closed Parsha. In other words, almost always, between two Parshios in the Torah, two paragraphs, if you want to call it, there is space that separates the two paragraphs. But here, the end of Parshas Michetz and the beginning of Parshas Vayechi are next to each other as if they were one paragraph. And the question is, if they're next to each other and there's no space that separates them, What do you mean as if they were one paragraph? It is one paragraph. But obviously, it's not the space that it's not the space that it's not the space that makes it two separate paragraphs. There are criteria that determines whether the certain psukim are continuous with the previous psukim, with the previous verses, or no, it really is a separate paragraph. But the law is, when the criteria are met, we have to put a space in between them when we write the Torah. And for some reason, even though here it talks about two completely perspectives of the Jewish people in Egypt, Parshas Miketz talks about the Jewish people settling, especially the end of Parshas Miketz. Excuse me, Vayigash, the end of Parshas Vayigash, talks about the Jewish people settling in Eretz Yisrael, in Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt. Vayechazu ba, they become citizens there. Vayirbu, they become many. They are honored in Egypt. And Vayichi Yaakov Eretz Yisrael Shvayas Shana, talking about the death of Yaakov, is talking about the beginning of the downfall of the Jewish people. So it clearly should have been two separate paragraphs. But the Torah, the halacha, determined that two have to be written together. Why should it be written together? The Rashi suggests, the Medrash suggests a number of reasons. But the Medrash says, Nista b'eineihem shel Yisrael, the eyes of the Jewish people became closed because of Tsaras Hashibud, because of the trouble of the enslavement. Because in a sense, with the death of Yaakov, and certainly with the death of Yosef, little by little, the enslavement began. So the question is what? Just because there's no space? So we see from that, Nistamu Einehem Shel Yisrael, so the eyes of the Jewish people became closed from Tsaras Hashibud. Now, Tsaras Hashibud can be understood in two ways. It could, Nistamu Einehem Shel Yisrael could mean sometimes when you can't bear something, you close your eyes. Almost like the ostrich approach. I would suggest, and and also Nistamai Nam Shel Yisrael could mean that the Jewish people, not that they were so much troubled that they had to close their eyes, but Nistamai Nam Shel Yisrael could mean that they didn't see the trouble that was coming. Either they didn't want to see or they didn't see. But the truth is the explanation is the same. Sometimes we don't see because we don't want to see. I remember my uncle, Rabbi Yisrael Shurin, told me that when my grandfather, my mother's father, Rabbi Moshe Shurin, he initially was the Rosh Yeshiva in Ritva. And then apparently it was difficult making a living there. And they had to deal, the needs of the family couldn't be met with the salary that he had as a Rosh Yeshiva. So he had to give up that position. And he went to the United States. But at that time, I guess, because people were somewhat concerned about the environment of the United States. the spiritual environment. And to a certain degree, probably at the advice of some of the Rabbanim at that time. So the family remained in Ritva, in the town. And my grandfather had jobs here in the United States, in Cambridge, Massachusetts for a while. And he was Rabbi of Kehillah there. And for a while, he was in New York. And he would send the money to his family in Europe. He would support them. And then after 5 years, he returned to Europe, and he was shocked with what he saw in Europe. And he gave a speech. He was, after all, he had been the Rosh Yeshiva in the town. And here he returns after a 5-year absence. And he was probably asked to speak in the shul. And he said to the Jews of Ritva, he says, when things happen, the change between one day and the other day are very small. And because they are very small, you don't notice it because it's not much different than yesterday. But I was gone for 5 years. And I sense the fear of the Jews and the anti-Semitism. But it does, even though you're fearful, he mentioned you don't walk out on the streets at night anymore. When I left, you were able to walk in the streets at night. You weren't as scared of being attacked and being killed. And now you're scared, but you came used to it because it happened little by little. So you don't recognize the change. But I was gone for 5 years, and I recognized the change. And he said to the people, you have to leave. You have to go to the United States. Go wherever you can go. Obviously, they didn't listen to him. And my uncle, Rabbi Yisrael, told me that he felt somewhat embarrassed because the people were smirking. They were, in a sense, they were blind to the changes that were taking place. And at the same time, they were in denial of what was taking place. In other words, the change from Parshas Vayigash, where the Jews were citizens, and the beginning, it was one very close to the other. Because one was very close to the other, they didn't see a change. There was no space. There was no time between the events, between the changing situation. And what very often happens, and this was true about the Jews of Germany also, the Jews of Germany, of all the countries in Europe, probably Germany, the Jews had it easiest. My uncle mentioned that when he was in Berlin, he did not see, and he was there just shortly before the war. He did not see any anti-Semitism. He mentioned that some of his professors at the University of Berlin philosophers who lectured on ethics. Immediately after, when the war started, they became the leading philosophers of the Nazi Party. What very often happens, even when we recognize that something bad happened, that we see something we're not happy, we have trouble. But it's not just that event that stands in front of us. It's the events that happened beforehand. And we think we're still in that past era, in that past period. We remember the glory, the Jews remember the glory of Yosef, the significant role, the position of the Jewish people in the early days of Egypt. And then sometimes, even when we recognize the event, we begin to rationalize. And we say, why did this happen? After all, the Jewish people helped the Egyptian culture so much. They saved the lives through Yosef. The lives of the Egyptians were saved. They couldn't all be anti-Semitic. They couldn't all be against the Jewish people. But what was the problem? The problem is this one Paro. But when this Paro dies, the Jewish people, the Egyptian people, will put us back in our position of glory. And yes, there were terrible incidents, but they were sure that when that Paro dies, everything will be okay. And that's sometimes our problem. Our problem is we turn to God only as a last resort. So long as we see other light at the end of the tunnel, and when there is light at the end of the tunnel, we fail to recognize that light at the end of the tunnel is also from God. But so long as we can conjecture that there's light at the end of the tunnel, we don't turn to God. In a sense, this was the lesson with Yosef. Vayhi mikesh shnasayim yomim uparo choleim. And the Medrash tells us that Ashrei boteach b'Shem, happy is one who puts his trust in God. Zeh Yosef, or it's good for one who puts his trust in God. That is Yosef, because Yosef said to the Sahamashkim, who's Kartani al Paro, you'll remember me to Paro. He said it twice. You'll make mention of my situation to Paro. Because of that, he had to spend 2 years extra in prison in Egypt. Question, everybody asks the question. First you say, Ashrei Tech Bashem, say Yosef, this is Yosef. And then you say that Yosef did not put his trust in God. But the halacha is that a person that's brought down in the Gemara and in Rishonim, that a person is considered to remember for the duration of a year. But after the duration of a year, people begin to forget. So for 1 year, Yosef in prison put his trust in the Sar Hamashkim. Maybe today, the Sar Hamashkim will remember me to Paro. But after a year, he gave up hope. So for each day, he put his trust in the Sar Hamashkim. He had to put his trust in God. Ashrei b'teich b'Hashem, said Yosef. In other words, he had to put his trust in God. Sometimes, yes, you do have to make attempts. Hishtadlus. You don't just throw it up in the air and leave it to God. But it's one thing to make hishtadlus, to make attempts. It's another thing to put your trust in man. The second year, and this, in a sense, repeated itself on a much broader scale with the Klal Yisrael. So long as Paro was alive, or that line of Paros were alive, continued. So they put their trust in the Egyptian people. But Vayamas Melech Mitzrayim, when the king of Egypt died, there was no light at the end of the tunnel anymore. So then they recognized that they're really in trouble. And then we called out to the God of our gods. So it seems, so this is the pshat, lefi pshuto. However, it's interesting when you take a look at the Sforna explains that it says Vayanuchu b'nei Yisrael, that they groaned, but not that they davened to God. But it says Vanitzak el Hashem al Ke'aboseinu, and other psukim, words in the psukim in this week, etc., that would seem to apply. They daven to God. So the Sforna says that tzaddikim daven to God and they cried out to God. The other people, they just groaned. But up to that point, they didn't groan. We have to understand why at this point is there an emphasis on the groaning? And the tzaddikim, this is the first time they davened. They waited all these years until the Melech Mitzrayim died. How are we to understand it? But I think that the tzaddikim, the tzaddikim davened all along. Now, there is a Reb Chaim, there's a machlokus between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Rambam's opinion is that davening is a chiyuv. I've mentioned this a number of times. The Rambam's opinion is that there's a mitzvah biblically, midiraisa, to daven once a day. Of course, rabbinically, we have to daven 3 times a day. And the Ramban's opinion is that only based Sarah is there a requirement to daven in time of trouble. And where is that mitzvah contained? That mitzvah contained b'chatzotzros. When the army attacks, you have to blow the trumpets. So part of the mitzvah, the Ramban says, of blowing the trumpets, or even when trumpets are not blown, is to daven to God for help in our time of trouble. Now, my uncle and my father, they both said that the mechayev, why is one required to daven to God? Because man is in trouble. But what is the dispute between the Rambam and the Ramban? The Rambam shita is that since man, we're always in trouble. We're always insecure. We just don't recognize our insecurity. We don't recognize that we're in trouble. And because we are always in trouble, we're always insecure. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The Torah says you have to daven every day. However, the Ramban's opinion is, he doesn't disagree with the Ramban, but he says the obligation, the biblical obligation of davening is only when you recognize you're in trouble. But Reb Chaim, my great-grandfather, said that even according to the Ramban, there is a mitzvah of davening. There's a mitzvah of davening anytime. But the question is, where is that mitzvah of davening? I mentioned many years ago, before we moved to Chicago, I remember Rav Wernick, who was the mashgiach at the Hebrew Theological College. He came to visit my father in New York, and he asked, where is that mitzvah? And my father said that it's included in Va'avadetem. And Rabbi Wernick gave an explanation, was based on Musar. It's part of Yiras Hashem, part of Ahavas Hashem, love of God, fear of God. I think that the mitzvah kiyumis is contained in the mitzvah chatzotros. You're obligated to daven, to get relief from the trouble when you see the trouble. But since man is always in trouble, when one davens without recognizing his trouble, but he recognizes that he is in trouble without knowing what the trouble is, he recognizes that he's insecure without recognizing exactly what the cause of his insecurity is. He fulfills the mitzvah even though it isn't obligatory upon him. And I think that that's how we can understand this forna. Matter of fact, it's interesting. The discussion, the Mishkan Yaakov, if I recall correctly, Mishkan Yaakov says that even though there's a biblical mitzvah, he assumes, like the Rambam, that there's a biblical mitzvah of davening, but there are cases where the Gemara mentions that the mitzvah is only rabbinic, and because of that, there are situations where a person doesn't have to daven. So the Mishkan Yaakov says, so long as you have a tzibur, so long as you have a community that is davening for you also, then the obligation of davening, the biblical obligation, is fulfilled. But if there is no tzibur davening for you, and you were there as an individual, then biblically you are required to daven. So, but the obligation of tefillah, the biblical obligation, is on the tzibur, on the community, to daven for the people that are there. I want to suggest, but perhaps I'm not talking from the perspective of the mitzvah tefillah. I have a lot of trouble with what the Mishkan Yaakov says. But the tefillah of others for the rest of the Jewish people, that's only is effective if we recognize we're in the need of God's help, if we recognize that we are secure, and we're insecure, if we recognize that we're insecure. But if we think everything will work out by itself, then the tefillahs for others will not help. And that perhaps is what the Sforna meant. The tzaddikim always davened. The righteous always davened. But those tefillahs only work if we recognize we're in the need of God's help. The righteous recognize that we're in the needs of God's help. But the others thought they were secure, this light at the end of the tunnel. They were looking forward to Paro dying. And then they will be restored to their seat of glory in Egypt. But then it was when Paro died, then nothing changed. So they recognized that they are slaves, and they will be eternally slaves in Egypt. They're dependent now on God. They recognize their insecurity. That situation, the tefillah of the tzaddikim could help. And I think so. And we take a look. Reb Chaim discusses the question about kavanah, of having the proper intention in davening. And Reb Chaim discusses the kavanah of having the proper intention in davening is one, standing in front of God, and secondly, perish hamilah, to understand the what you're saying. I think there's a third kavanah, and perhaps this kavanah is necessary, perhaps throughout the whole davening. Perhaps that would be okay just in the first bracha. I don't want to get into that. In other words, you have on one hand, you have to recognize standing before God, as Reb Chaim said. If you don't realize that you're standing before God, then it's not davening. Then you're talking to the wall. It's not even a halacha that you need kavanah. It's not davening if you don't. If I stand in front of the wall and I just utter the words, so I'm not talking to God. The definition of davening is talking to God. And then you have to understand the words that you say. But even if you don't understand the words, it seems from Reb Chaim, it's still considered a davening. But I think it will only be considered a davening if you realize that you need God's help. If you don't realize you need God's help, if you don't realize that you're insecure, then it's not a davening either. And I think perhaps this is the point that's being brought out, that up to that point, the Jewish people, they didn't feel so insecure. Of course, they saw their trouble, their children were killed and everything. But they thought long term, hey, we are going to be on top. We will be restored to our position of Yosef that we had with Yosef's time. They didn't even think, perhaps, about going to Eretz Yisrael. Yes, there were individual issues, but they remembered the good days. Because they remembered the good days, they were in denial of the present situation. Because they were in denial of the present situation. So they didn't turn to God. They didn't even cry out. It wasn't vayondefu. It's only when there was no light at the end of the tunnel. And then it says in Yeshaya, Us tikra v'Hashem yaneh teshava v'yomar hineni. God will say, here I am, because, and in a sense, when we take a look at the pasuk, Vayar Elokim es b'nei Yisrael v'yed Elokim. What do you mean, Vayar Elokim es b'nei Yisrael? God saw the Jewish people. But the answer is, in Eicha, the Nesivos in his parish in Eicha says that very often God does not punish the Jewish people, But what happens is when the Jews do not act properly, when the Jewish people do not recognize their obligation to God, so what happens is God withdraws and he lets nature take its own course. And so this is the idea. Vayar Lakim es Bnei Yisrael, God saw the Jewish people. That represents the beginning of God intervening in a more major way. Because so long as the davening was without kavanah, what is kavanah of davening? Kavanah of davening is recognize I'm talking to God. Recognizing God. And recognizing that I'm in the need of God's help. When we see God, when we're omed lifnei hashchina, the essence of davening is standing before God and recognizing our need of God's help. So Vayar Lakim es Bnei Yisrael. Vayar Lakim es Bnei Yisrael, in a sense, that's recognizing the end of the withdrawal of God from the situation. But in a sense, it's not that God withdrew, but we pushed God out of the picture. So this is, but when we have the proper attitude in davening, when we stand before God, and we don't just say words, and we say, and we have the kavanah of omed lifnei hashchina, and we realize that we're in the need of God's help, and we're asking God. So then we are putting God back into the picture. So Vayar Elokim, when we see God, when we stand before Him, when we talk with Him, when we recognize we're in need of His help, then figuratively God sees us as well. He's back in the picture. Vayed Elokim. So God, this is all expressions showing the difference between before and after. In a sense, we pushed God out of the picture by not recognizing our dependency upon Him. But once we davened, once we recognize our dependency upon HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and even Ve'yanchu B'nei Yisrael Min Avoda, when we realize how insecure we are without His help. So then the tefillos of the tzaddikim were able, in the words of the words of the Sforna, were able to be effective. So then the process of Geula, could take place. And in a sense, we could say that that's the pasuk in Yeshaya, As tikra v'Hashem yaneh, tishava v'yomer hineni. God will say, here I am. When you come to Him and say, here I am, I'm standing before you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, here I am. We have to recognize that we are standing before God. And then God recognizes, then God acts in a manner that we understand it as God standing before us. And this is, in a sense, the whole idea behind the big Chumash Shemos, behind Shibud Mitzrayim, recognizing our dependency upon HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when we recognize our dependency on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then the Geula begins. Okay.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. One question here about Reb Chaim Volozhiner said the last stop of the Jews will be the United States. So should Jews move out of the United States? Are they allowed to move to stay here because of what Reb Chaim Volozhiner said? Should they move out of Russia and Ukraine if they're there right now?
He just said that the last the last station of Torah will be in the United States. The last big Makam Torah before coming back to Eretz Yisrael will be in the United States. He was talking about, it's very interesting that Rabbi Bear on Purim, he would line up his Talmidim as a train. He was like the captain of the train, and he would go choo choo. This way I was told. I don't know if it's true. The choo choo choo, whatever, and make sounds like a train. And then he would mention the different places where the Jewish people throughout their history would be, and the last stop would be Yerushalayim.
This time of year when sunrise is the latest that it gets, do women could women daven before it gets light outside? Do they have to, or can they daven even, an hour and a half before sunrise?
Well, it's Shmon Esrei. If they're just saying Shmon Esrei, then they could daven an hour and a half before sunrise, especially if they're getting up to work, But if it's Shema and the Bircha Shema, it shouldn't be before that, There are some special situations where it's allowed, but as a general rule. So if they're just davening Shmon Esrei, it wouldn't be a problem.
But Shema, they shouldn't say.
Shema, they shouldn't say that early. Let me put it this way. I'm certainly not going to make a general statement. If somebody has a particular situation, then they can call me or whoever their Rav is to discuss it. But I don't want to issue a general statement in regard to at that point. It came an issue years ago when they changed the clock because of the energy shortage. I guess now that the president is using our emergency energy, it's not such a problem anymore. So so at that time, places in Toledo, Ohio, and all that. So there was a heter given that for them to daven the whole davening, I think, from Amud Shachar. Okay. The question is, when is Amud Shachar anyway? That's a separate question. It's a question that a person should ask on an individual basis. There's no. It's dangerous to answer it as a generalized question.
There aren't any other questions here.